June 28, 1944. Outside Caen, Normandy. British infantry from the 15th Scottish Division are dug into hedgerows, exhausted from 3 weeks of continuous combat. Then they hear it, a sound unlike anything in their training. Not the whistle of artillery shells. Not the roar of aircraft. Something else. Something wrong. A rising howl, like dozens of women screaming in agony simultaneously. The sound builds from distant wail to overwhelming shriek as 6 rockets tear through the air at 1,100 feet per second. Veterans who survived artillery barrages at El Alamein later say this was worse. Artillery you heard after it exploded. This sound arrived before impact, giving you 3 to 4 seconds to know death was coming but not where it would land. Then the explosions. 6 32-kilogram warheads detonate in rapid succession across 100 square meters. Not precision strikes, area saturation. Fragmentation turns hedgerows into killing zones. The overpressure liquefies organs inside intact bodies. Survivors describe finding casualties with no visible wounds, just bleeding from ears and eyes where shockwaves ruptured everything inside. The weapon was called Nebelwerfer, smoke projector in German. Allied troops called it Moaning Minnie or Screaming Mimi. German engineers designed it to confuse League of Nations inspectors about its true purpose. Instead, they accidentally created the first weapon where the sound was as devastating as the explosives. Before we reveal how Germany weaponized terror through audio engineering, destroy that subscribe button. Like and comment which WWII weapon terrifies you most. This channel exposes warfare's darkest innovations. Now let me show you why Allied soldiers feared the sound more than the blast. The Nebelwerfer's origins lie in one of history's most cynical pieces of bureaucratic deception. After Germany's defeat in World War I, the Treaty of Versailles imposed severe restrictions on German military development. Article 171 specifically prohibited Germany from possessing or manufacturing chemical weapons. The treaty's framers, having witnessed mustard gas and chlorine attacks during the Great War, were determined to prevent Germany from rebuilding chemical warfare capabilities. But the treaty had a loophole. It didn't prohibit smoke projectors, devices for creating battlefield smokescreens to conceal troop movements. Smoke was considered a legitimate defensive tool, not a weapon. German military planners in the 1920s saw an opportunity. If you designed a smoke projector that could generate smokescreens but was engineered to also launch explosive rockets, you could develop artillery systems while technically complying with Versailles restrictions. The program began in 1931 under the innocuous designation Nebeltruppen, smoke troops. These units were officially tasked with creating battlefield obscurement. Their equipment was classified as chemical defense material, not weapons. League of Nations inspectors reviewing German rearmament saw smoke generators and chemical defense training, exactly what the treaty permitted. What they didn't realize was that the same launchers designed to project smoke canisters could launch high-explosive rockets with minimal modification. WWII 1936. With Hitler openly violating Versailles provisions, the Nebeltruppen program accelerated. Engineers at Rheinmetall Borsig developed the 15 cm Nebelwerfer 41, a 6-barreled rocket launcher mounted on a 2-wheeled carriage borrowed from existing Pak 36 anti-tank gun designs. The weapon was simple, almost primitive. 6 steel tubes arranged in a circle, each 130 centimeters long, mounted on a traversable base. No complicated recoil mechanisms. No advanced fire control systems. Just tubes, rockets, and basic elevation/traverse adjustments. The rockets themselves represented the weapon's true innovation. Each projectile measured 15 centimeters in diameter and weighed 34 kilograms fully loaded, 32 kilograms of which was the warhead. But the engineering was backwards compared to conventional rockets. Normally, a rocket motor sits at the rear, pushing the warhead forward. The Nebelwerfer rocket put the motor at the front with the warhead at the rear. This seemingly counterintuitive design served multiple purposes. First, it allowed the rocket to spin stabilize. The 26 exhaust ports angled slightly, causing the rocket to rotate during flight like a bullet from a rifled barrel. This spin provided gyroscopic stability without requiring fins, which simplified manufacturing. Second, placing the motor forward meant the center of gravity remained relatively constant as propellant burned. This improved accuracy compared to conventional rocket designs where the center of gravity shifted dramatically during flight. But there was an unintended consequence that German engineers didn't fully anticipate during testing. Those 26 exhaust ports, positioned around the rocket's nose and angled for spin, created an acoustical phenomenon during flight. As the rocket accelerated to over 340 meters per second, air forced through those ports at high velocity generated harmonics, multiple overlapping frequencies that human ears perceived as a rising wail. The faster the rocket flew, the higher the pitch climbed, creating that distinctive moan that would give the weapon its allied nickname. Initial testing in 1940 focused on ballistics and explosive performance. German engineers measured range, approximately 6,900 meters maximum. They evaluated accuracy, mediocre at best, with dispersion patterns measuring 60 to 80 meters at maximum range. They assessed explosive effectiveness. The 32 kilograms warhead produced satisfactory fragmentation and blast. What they didn't rigorously test was the psychological impact of the sound, because psychological effects weren't considered primary weapon characteristics in pre-war military doctrine. The Nebelwerfer 41 entered combat in June 1941 during Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The 1st Nebeltruppen battalions deployed behind advancing panzer divisions, providing fire support during breakthrough operations. The weapon's tactical role was simple: saturate defensive positions with rapid fire, suppress enemy troops long enough for German infantry to close and assault. Soviet troops encountering Nebelwerfers for the first time experienced something unprecedented. Traditional artillery gave warning. You heard the distant boom of guns firing, then seconds or minutes later shells arrived. This provided time, however brief, to take cover. Nebelwerfers reversed the sequence. The first indication of incoming fire was that horrific wailing sound, growing louder, coming from multiple directions because rockets didn't follow predictable ballistic arcs like shells. Then explosions. Soviet after-action reports from summer 1941 described troops abandoning positions before rockets even landed. The sound alone caused psychological collapse among units that had previously withstood conventional artillery bombardment. One captured Soviet officer interrogated in July 1941 stated, "The screaming weapons break men's minds before they break their bodies. Soldiers who are brave under shellfire become animals when they hear that sound. They run without orders, without thinking." The German High Command took notice. Here was a weapon whose psychological impact far exceeded its technical specifications. The Nebelwerfer's inaccuracy, normally considered a flaw, became an advantage. Because rockets scattered across wide areas rather than hitting specific targets, the sound came from everywhere simultaneously. Soldiers couldn't identify a specific direction to run from or take cover against. The auditory assault was omnidirectional, overwhelming, unavoidable. Production accelerated through 1941 and 1942. By the end of 1942, the Wehrmacht had over 300 Nebelwerfer batteries deployed across the Eastern Front. Each battery typically consisted of 3 launchers, with each launcher firing 6 rockets. A battery could therefore launch 18 rockets in roughly 10 seconds, the time required for experienced crews to fire all tubes in rapid succession. Those 18 rockets would saturate an area approximately 100 meters by 100 meters, the sound arriving before the explosives. The loading procedure was brutal work. Each 34 kilograms rocket had to be manually lifted and inserted into the steel tubes. The rockets were loaded from the front, requiring crews to stand directly in front of the weapon. Once all 6 tubes were loaded, the crew would retreat to a firing position roughly 10 meters away, behind protective cover if available. The launcher was fired electrically using a hand-crank generator connected by cable. One crew member would crank the generator while another operated the firing switch. The actual firing sequence created its own dangers. The rocket motors ignited inside the steel tubes, and massive exhaust plumes blasted forward from all 6 barrels simultaneously. The backblast extended 15 to 20 meters in front of the weapon, a cone of superheated gases hot enough to ignite vegetation and scorch exposed skin. Any crew member caught in that blast zone would be killed instantly. The cloud of smoke and dust created by firing was so massive that it immediately revealed the launcher's position to enemy observers, making rapid repositioning essential. The reload time was the weapon's critical vulnerability. After firing all 6 rockets, the crew needed approximately 90 seconds to reload under ideal conditions, far longer under combat stress with incoming counter-battery fire. This meant Nebelwerfer units operated under constant time pressure. Fire, relocate, reload, fire again. German doctrine emphasized shoot and scoot tactics long before that term entered common military vocabulary. Counter-battery became the primary threat to Nebelwerfer crews. The massive smoke signature from firing made concealment impossible. Soviet artillery observers learned to watch for the distinctive 6-plume pattern and immediately call for fire. The race was simple: could the Nebelwerfer crew displace before Soviet shells arrived? Often they couldn't. Casualty rates among Nebeltruppen were significantly higher than conventional artillery units, precisely because the weapon signature made them priority targets. Stalingrad in late 1942 became the Nebelwerfer's proving ground as urban warfare weapon. The close-quarter city fighting limited conventional artillery's effectiveness. Shells had to arc high to clear buildings, reducing accuracy and impact. Nebelwerfers, with their relatively flat trajectories and rapid-fire capability, could saturate entire city blocks in seconds. German units defending Stalingrad's ruins used Nebelwerfers to break up Soviet assaults before they could gain momentum. The psychological impact intensified in urban environments. The sound of rockets echoing off buildings created horrifying acoustic effects. Soviet soldiers described the wailing as coming from inside their own heads, a sound that seemed to penetrate skull and brain. The explosions, confined by surrounding structures, created overpressure waves that were deadlier than the same explosions in open terrain. Bodies found in Stalingrad's rubble showed a horrifying pattern: external wounds minimal, internal organs liquefied by pressure waves. WWII early 1943, as Germany transitioned from offensive to defensive operations across the Eastern Front, Nebelwerfers found their ideal tactical role. Defensive warfare required disrupting enemy attacks at critical moments, breaking up formations before they could establish footholds. The Nebelwerfer's ability to deliver massive firepower rapidly made it perfect for this mission. When Soviet units began an assault, Nebelwerfer batteries would unleash concentrated barrages on approach routes, staging areas, and breakthrough points. The weapon's inaccuracy paradoxically enhanced its defensive effectiveness. Attacking forces couldn't predict exactly where rockets would land, only that they'd saturate a general area. This uncertainty forced attackers to disperse, slowing their momentum. Soviet commanders reported that formations subjected to Nebelwerfer fire before assaulting typically required 15 to 30 minutes to reorganize, time that German defenders used to strengthen positions and reposition reserves. The sound's psychological power grew as word spread among Soviet troops. Veterans who'd survived Nebelwerfer barrages warned new soldiers about the moaning. This preconditioning amplified the weapon's effect. Soldiers who'd never encountered Nebelwerfers but heard the stories would panic at the first wail, their imaginations filling in details their experience couldn't provide. The weapon's reputation became a weapon itself. German propaganda exploited this fear. Radio broadcasts to Soviet lines specifically mentioned the rockets that scream. Leaflets dropped over Soviet positions depicted Nebelwerfers with text warning that German defenses included weapons that announced death before delivering it. This psychological warfare campaign, coordinated with actual Nebelwerfer deployments, created atmosphere of dread around German defensive positions. June 1944. The Western Allies invading Normandy encountered Nebelwerfers for the first time. British, Canadian, and American troops who'd fought in North Africa and Italy had faced conventional German artillery extensively. They understood artillery, the distant thunder of guns, the incoming whistle of shells, the rhythm of barrage and counter-barrage. Nebelwerfers violated everything they thought they knew about artillery warfare. The first encounters occurred during the early push inland from the beaches. British infantry advancing through the bocage hedgerows near can heard a sound that stopped entire companies cold. Veterans described it as primal, inhuman, wrong on a level that bypassed rational thought and triggered instinctive terror. The sound traveled faster than the rockets themselves. Sound waves at 343 meters per second versus rockets at 340 meters per second, giving soldiers roughly 3 to 4 seconds of audio warning before impact. Those seconds were psychologically devastating. You knew something terrible was coming. You knew it was already too late to effectively take cover. You couldn't determine direction because the acoustic properties of the bocage reflected and distorted sound. All you could do was press yourself into the ground and wait for the explosions. That helplessness, that forced passivity in face of approaching death, broke men who'd stood firm under conventional bombardment. American forces coined the nickname Screaming Mimi, while British and Canadian troops called it Moaning Minnie. Both names reflected attempts to humanize and thereby psychologically diminish the weapon, making it a character rather than an impersonal killing machine. The nicknames didn't help. If anything, personifying the weapon made it more horrifying. It wasn't just artillery. It was Minnie, and Minnie was coming for you. The Normandy bocage geography amplified the Nebelwerfer's effectiveness. The hedgerows created natural compartments that confined blast effects and fragmentation. A rocket detonating in an open field disperses energy across wide area. The same rocket detonating in a confined hedgerow corridor channels blast and fragments along the hedge line, increasing lethality dramatically. German Nebeltruppen units learned to target hedgerow intersections and sunken lanes. Anywhere Allied troops would be channeled into confined spaces. The fragmentation pattern of Nebelwerfer warheads proved particularly deadly in bocage fighting. The 32 kilograms warhead contained approximately 2.5 kilograms of TNT surrounded by the warhead casing. Upon detonation, the casing shattered into thousands of fragments traveling at supersonic velocities. In open terrain, fragments dispersed across wide area with decreasing density. In hedgerow fighting, the earthen banks and vegetation contained fragments, creating kill zones that extended 20 to 30 meters along hedge lines. British casualties from Nebelwerfer attacks showed distinctive patterns. Medical officers reported high percentages of multiple fragment wounds. Single soldiers hit by 10 to 15 separate fragments, indicating they were caught in concentrated fragment clouds. Overpressure injuries were more common than in conventional artillery casualties. Internal hemorrhaging, ruptured eardrums, collapsed lungs. The confined spaces where soldiers took cover amplified pressure waves beyond what open terrain explosions would produce. The sound's psychological impact manifested in combat stress reactions. British medical officers at field hospitals near Cannes documented cases of soldiers exhibiting acute anxiety responses specifically triggered by high-pitched sounds. One corporal hospitalized with fragment wounds would panic at the sound of Jeep brakes squealing. The pitch was similar enough to Nebelwerfer wail to trigger immediate terror response. These weren't isolated cases. Psychiatrists treating combat stress noted that Nebelwerfer survivors showed higher rates of sound-triggered anxiety than soldiers who'd experienced comparable casualty rates from conventional artillery. Allied intelligence services worked frantically to understand the Nebelwerfer and develop counter-tactics. Captured launchers were shipped to Britain for technical analysis. German prisoners were interrogated about Nebeltruppen tactics and deployment patterns. The intelligence gathered was sobering. Germany had over 400 Nebelwerfer batteries operational across all fronts by mid-1944. Production was increasing, not decreasing, despite Allied bombing of German factories. The Wehrmacht considered the weapon essential to defensive operations. The technical analysis revealed both vulnerabilities and strengths. The launcher itself was relatively fragile. Direct artillery hits would destroy it completely, and even near misses could damage the traversing mechanism or bend barrels. But the launcher's simplicity meant repairs were straightforward, and manufacturing didn't require sophisticated industrial capacity. Any German factory capable of basic metalworking could produce Nebelwerfer components. This decentralized production made the weapon system nearly impossible to eliminate through strategic bombing. Allied forces developed several counterattacks through summer 1944. Counter-battery became priority. The moment Nebelwerfer smoke signatures appeared, Allied artillery would saturate that position with return fire. This worked when Allied artillery was available and properly positioned, but German crews learned to fire from positions where immediate displacement was possible. Urban areas, forest edges, reverse slopes, anywhere the crew could fire and then rapidly move to cover before counter-battery arrived. Allied soldiers developed their own ground-level tactics for surviving Nebelwerfer attacks. The 3 to 4 second audio warning, while psychologically horrifying, did provide time to react if soldiers could override their panic response. Training emphasized that the sound meant get as flat as possible immediately. Not run. Not seek better cover. Just drop. Fragments traveled horizontally, so any depression in the ground, A ditch, a shell crater, even the furrow created by a plow, could mean the difference between life and death. Some units developed sound recognition drills. Officers would play recordings of Nebelwerfer launches, captured from German training films, to familiarize troops with the sound under controlled conditions. The theory was that familiarity would reduce panic response. Results were mixed. Hearing a recording in a safe training environment provided intellectual recognition but didn't fully prepare soldiers for the visceral terror of experiencing that sound while under actual attack. The German defenders, meanwhile, refined their Nebelwerfer employment doctrine. They discovered that massed batteries firing simultaneously created psychological effects far beyond what individual launchers could achieve. A single 6-rocket salvo was terrifying. 3 batteries firing 54 rockets simultaneously was overwhelming. The sound became a physical pressure, the explosions a continuous roar rather than discrete impacts. Allied soldiers described these mass barrages as inducing temporary dissociation, a sense of being outside one's body, observing events from distance rather than experiencing them directly. Operation Epsom, the British attempt to outflank Caen in late June, encountered concentrated Nebelwerfer fire at Hill 112. German Nebeltruppen batteries positioned on reverse slopes fired over the hill crest, saturating British positions with rolling barrages that walked forward and back across the contested ground. British after-action reports noted that casualties from Nebelwerfer fire during Epsom exceeded casualties from all other German artillery combined. The weapon's ability to deliver rapid, concentrated fire during the critical moments of British attacks disrupted momentum repeatedly. The German Army group center's collapse in summer 1944 during Operation Bagration showed Nebelwerfers in pure defensive role. Massively outnumbered Soviet forces advancing across Belarus, German units used Nebelwerfer batteries as mobile defensive anchors. When Soviet breakthroughs occurred, Nebeltruppen units would rapidly deploy, saturate the breakthrough point with rocket fire, then displace before Soviet counterbattery could respond. This slowed Soviet advances enough for German infantry to establish new defensive lines. But the weapon's limitations became increasingly apparent as Germany's strategic situation deteriorated. The 90-second reload time was manageable when your forces controlled territory and could establish protected firing positions. When you're in constant retreat, unable to establish defensive positions, that reload time becomes fatal vulnerability. Nebeltruppen casualties spiked during the retreat through Poland and East Prussia in late 1944. Units caught during reload were overrun by Soviet armor before they could displace. Ammunition supply presented another challenge. Each rocket weighed 34 kilograms, making transport logistics complex. A single Nebelwerfer battery firing at maximum rate could expend 1,000 kilograms of ammunition in minutes. German supply systems, already strained by fuel shortages and Allied air interdiction, struggled to keep Nebeltruppen units supplied. Batteries would reach critical tactical positions, fire 1 or 2 salvos, then become combat ineffective due to lack of ammunition. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 saw concentrated Nebelwerfer employment during the opening bombardment. German planners positioned Nebeltruppen batteries along the entire attack front, coordinating their fire to achieve maximum psychological impact. At 0530 hours on December 16th, hundreds of Nebelwerfers fired simultaneously, the largest coordinated rocket barrage on the Western Front. American positions across an 80-mile front received devastating salvos, the combined sound audible 20 miles away. The initial shock was everything German planners hoped for. American units, many consisting of inexperienced replacements or exhausted divisions resting in quiet sectors, were completely unprepared for the intensity of the barrage. The sound alone caused panic in some positions. Officers reported entire platoons abandoning positions before the first explosions, convinced they were facing overwhelming force. The psychological victory was total for approximately 2 hours. Then American artillery responded. Counter-battery radar, only recently deployed to frontline units, detected Nebelwerfer launch signatures. American artillery achieved what Soviet forces had struggled to accomplish: systematic suppression of Nebeltruppen units. Within 12 hours of the offensive start, German rocket fire had diminished significantly. The launchers were still operational, but crews couldn't establish firing positions without immediate counter-battery response. The weapon that had terrorized Allied forces for 3 years was being neutralized by technological advancement. WWII January 1945. Nebelwerfer effectiveness had declined markedly on both fronts. Allied forces had adapted psychologically. The sound still triggered fear, but no longer caused the panic it had in 1944. Tactical countermeasures had improved. Dispersed formations, rapid movement after the audio warning, aggressive counter-battery fire. Most critically, Allied air superiority meant Nebeltruppen units moving in daylight faced immediate air attack. The smoke signature that revealed launcher positions to ground observers was even more visible to aircraft. The final months of the war saw Nebelwerfers deployed in increasingly desperate circumstances. German forces defending Berlin in April 1945 used remaining Nebeltruppen units for urban defense. The launchers, designed for mobile warfare, were now positioned in fixed locations, street intersections, parks, bombed-out buildings. Crews fired at approaching Soviet armor and infantry at ranges far shorter than doctrine recommended, sometimes as close as 500 meters. At that range, the backblast from firing posed almost as much danger to surrounding German troops as the rockets posed to their targets. Soviet accounts from the Berlin fighting described Nebelwerfer attacks as more spectacular than effective at this stage. The sound remained terrifying, but Soviet troops had learned through 4 years of warfare that the terror passed. The explosions came, you either survived or you didn't, and then you continued advancing. The psychological weapon had lost its power through sheer familiarity. When you've heard Moaning Minnie hundreds of times and lived, it becomes just another battlefield sound. Post-war analysis revealed that Germany produced approximately 5,500 Nebelwerfer 41 launchers during the war, consuming roughly 5.5 million rockets. The production figures are staggering given Germany's increasing resource shortages. That the Wehrmacht continued manufacturing Nebelwerfers until the war's final weeks indicates how valuable German commanders considered the weapon despite its limitations. Allied armies captured hundreds of intact Nebelwerfers in 1945. American and Soviet technical intelligence teams conducted extensive testing and analysis. The Americans concluded that while the weapon had been tactically effective, it offered no revolutionary advances worth copying. American rocket artillery programs already underway, systems like the T-34 Calliope, provided similar saturation fire capabilities with better logistics and less vulnerability to counter-battery. The Soviets reached different conclusions. Soviet rocket artillery doctrine, built around weapons like the Katyusha, already emphasized massed fire and psychological impact. Soviet engineers studied the Nebelwerfer's spin stabilization system and acoustic properties with interest. While they didn't directly copy the German design, elements of Nebelwerfer engineering appeared in post-war Soviet rocket systems, particularly the focus on sound as psychological weapon. The weapon's most lasting impact was psychological rather than tactical. Veterans who survived Nebelwerfer attacks described it as among their most terrifying combat experiences, often ranking it above tank attacks, aerial bombardment, or conventional artillery. The involuntary nature of the fear response, the inability to control one's reaction to that sound, left psychological scars that persisted for decades. British medical studies in the 1950s examining combat stress in World War II veterans found that acoustic trauma responses were significantly more common among Normandy veterans than those who served in other theaters. The distinctive sound of the Nebelwerfer, unlike generic artillery sounds, created specific auditory memories that could trigger severe anxiety responses years or decades after the war. Some veterans reported being unable to tolerate sounds superficially similar to Nebelwerfer wail, air raid sirens, certain musical instruments, even wind whistling through specific structures. The Nebelwerfer's legacy extends beyond its immediate tactical impact into broader questions about weapons design and psychological warfare. German engineers creating a smoke projector to circumvent treaty restrictions accidentally discovered that weapon systems could terrorize through sound as effectively as through explosive power. This wasn't intentional design, it was emergent property of engineering choices made for entirely different reasons. The forward-mounted rocket motor, chosen for ballistic stability, created acoustic signatures that proved psychologically devastating. Modern military psychology recognizes this phenomenon. Weapons that engage multiple senses, visual, auditory, tactile, create more severe stress responses than weapons that kill silently. The A-10 Warthog's U-8 Avenger cannon produces a distinctive BRRRT sound that serves no tactical purpose but significantly impacts enemy morale. Attack helicopters' rotor signatures become psychological weapons when opposing forces learn to associate specific sounds with incoming fire. The Nebelwerfer demonstrated this principle decades before military doctrine formally acknowledged it. The weapon also illustrated diminishing returns of psychological warfare. The Nebelwerfer was most effective against troops encountering it for the first time. Soviet forces in 1941, Western allies in 1944. As soldiers gained experience and survival knowledge spread through units, the psychological impact decreased. By 1945, the sound still frightened, but no longer paralyzed. Habituation to even the most terrifying stimuli occurs when exposure is repeated and survival is possible. Post-war rocket artillery development worldwide incorporated some Nebelwerfer lessons while rejecting others. The principle of rapid saturation fire became standard. The vulnerability created by massive launch signatures led to emphasis on shoot-and-scoot mobility. But no major military attempted to replicate the Nebelwerfer's acoustic properties. Engineers recognized that sound-based psychological effects were temporary advantages that enemies would adapt to. Several Nebelwerfers survive in museums today. The U.S. Army's Rock Island Arsenal displays a complete six-barreled launcher with original rockets. The Imperial War Museum in London maintains a Nebelwerfer 41 in firing position. These museum pieces look innocuous: steel tubes on wheeled carriages, industrial artifacts without obvious menace. Veterans seeing them in museums report experiencing immediate anxiety responses, the physical presence triggering memories decades dormant. Audio recordings of Nebelwerfer launches exist, captured from German training films and Allied combat footage. Listening to these recordings provides intellectual understanding but can't replicate the visceral experience. The sound needs to be 110 plus decibels, coming from multiple directions, with your knowledge that explosions will follow. Context transforms sound from curiosity into terror. The question of effectiveness remains debated. Did Nebelwerfers meaningfully alter battlefield outcomes, or were they psychological weapons whose impact was largely subjective? The statistical evidence is mixed. Casualty rates from Nebelwerfer fire were comparable to conventional artillery of similar caliber. The psychological impact, while severe, proved temporary. Formations subjected to Nebelwerfer barrages typically recovered combat effectiveness within 30 to 60 minutes. Yet commanders on both sides considered the weapon significant. German forces prioritized Nebelwerfer deployment in defensive operations throughout 1943 to 1945. Allied forces devoted substantial intelligence resources to understanding and countering the weapon. Veterans consistently rank Nebelwerfer attacks among their most memorable combat experiences. These subjective assessments suggest the weapon's psychological impact exceeded what casualty statistics alone would indicate. The Nebelwerfer represents warfare's evolution toward sensory assault. Modern battlefields attack not just bodies but minds. Overwhelming cognitive processing through multiple simultaneous stimuli. The screaming rocket, the thermal signature visible through night vision, the radar return, the acoustic signature. Contemporary weapons engage defenders across multiple sensory channels simultaneously, creating cognitive overload that degrades decision-making even when physical danger is manageable. That rising wail across Normandy hedgerows, Stalingrad ruins, and Eastern Front steppes wasn't just sound. It was weaponized dread, acoustic manifestation of helplessness, 3-second countdown to random death. Allied troops called it Moaning Minnie, trying to make it less terrible through personification. It didn't work. The sound remained what it was, accidental byproduct of engineering that proved more psychologically devastating than designers could have predicted. 6 steel tubes, 34-kilogram rockets, and exhaust ports that screamed. Simple technology, profound terror, temporary advantage. That was the Nebelwerfer's true legacy.